In this video, let's talk about laying down foundations for a legacy of faithfulness in the generation that comes after us. There's a couple in the Bible that surprisingly has lots to teach us in how to parent children in such a way where we lay down foundations that will see them go on to live a legacy of faithfulness in their lives. And those parents, or that parenting couple, is Moses' parent, Amram and Jochebed. And so we encounter and see them play in their household as they're looking to parent their three children that God has placed in their care. That is Moses, Aaron, and Miriam. And they parent them in such a way where we go on to see these three children being referred to as great leaders in the life of Israel. And so in Micah chapter 6, as God is indicting the people of Israel for not having been faithful to him in their covenant, he reminds them that back in the day in Egypt, as he was bringing about this great salvation for their nation, he gave them as a blessing in leadership Moses, Aaron, and Miriam. And so these three children of Amram and Jochebed go on to be key central figures and leaders throughout a time in Israel's history where God was at work the most. Which parents wouldn't want to see their children be used in that way? I've got three particular boys, and my wife and I's hope for those three boys would be that they will grow up to be the kind of people, the kind of leaders of great integrity and love and faithfulness that God will use them in this world and through their lives to bring about, to continue to work it out, His plan for redemption towards people. And so as a parent, I look really with great interest at the parenting model of Moses' parents. How did they manage in some way to really see through the way that they have parented their children, to see them go on to have great significance in the world? I think there are three things we can observe in that. But before we look at those three things, we need to remember as parents, whether it be biological parents or spiritual parents, that their legacy of faithfulness will be the grace of God at work in their lives. Yes, everything is by the grace of God. Only God will do this and achieve this. But the grace of God is never exclusive of our efforts, but it is inclusive of our efforts. And so God is always welcoming us, calling us to be part and parcel of what He is doing. And that in itself is His grace. And so while we rely upon the grace of God, as God is shaping in our children the character and love that they ought to have for Him, and the beliefs and convictions by which they will go on to live by for Him through His grace and grace alone. But He has called us as parents to participate in seeing those things be embedded in their lives, laying down a foundation for a legacy of faithfulness. And so it is by His grace, but as parents, we got to parent in a particular way. Now, back to Moses' parents. Three things we could see that are really critical in laying down a foundation for a legacy of faithfulness in the generation that comes after us. The first thing we see Moses' parents do is actually they were resolute, committed on a specific purpose to follow. They embraced God's purpose in their lives. And so the writer of Hebrews, in Hebrews 11, writes, and he says that by faith Moses, when he was born, he was hidden away by his parents for 3 months. 3 months they hid him away. Why? Because they saw in him that he was beautiful in God's sight. And so as they looked at this child that God had given to them, somehow was impressed upon their soul that God had plans for this boy. And because God had these plans for this boy, what did they decide to do? They decided to follow that specific plan, even while they were in Egypt under the threat of Pharaoh, who was looking to try to kill this particular boy. And so they had a choice to make in their life. Here is Pharaoh and his demands for this boy's life, and there's God who has created this boy, made this boy, who's at work in this boy's life to bring about his purposes. Which purpose would they choose to follow? They chose to follow God's purpose. And so Establishing a legacy actually begins with me. Establishing a legacy begins with me as a parent. Am I a parent who's committed to the purposes of God? Am I a parent who is laboring in my own life, in my own heart towards God to be about Him and Him alone, pursuing Him and Him alone, living for Him and Him alone, so that my commitment and my pursuit, resolute pursuit towards God will be seen and actually seen at play in the way that I parent my children, instilling into them a greater love for who? For God, and first and foremost, to follow Him and Him alone. And so that's the first thing we see in Moses' parents. The second thing we learn from Moses' parents is that we got to set an example. We got to set an example for our children to follow, and in particular, set an example to follow in and through adversity and suffering. And so Moses' parents are living during a difficult time in Egypt. First of all, they are slaves who each day have to wake up each day, go to work as slaves, labor each day as slaves because they were under the oppression of the Egyptians. So they are slaves, which they means by application that they would have probably be poor, without much in this world, without all the toys and pleasures that most of us kind of pursue in this world. So they are slaves who are poor, and then they are not just parents of one child, but not two but three children living in their household. And through it all, knowing that as Moses is being born, that Pharaoh is looking to kill every male child in Egypt, they decide to remain resolute to try to pursue God's purpose first and foremost, and hide this boy. And what they are doing then in that household is they are setting an example for the children that, man, adversity in life will come, suffering in life will come our way, opposition and pain and all those things will come our way, but will we be a people that will remain resolute in the purposes of God? And so they instilled in their children could see and witness by the way that they were conducting themselves through such difficult times, setting an example for them to follow. If you think about it, oftentimes in life, it is how people deal with adversity. So the adversity that comes their way, the way that they deal with that adversity is what inspires us the most. And so you think about secular leaders like perhaps Nelson Mandela, right down to biblical figures like Christ. We see that it is oftentimes in the face of adversity that people really inspire us the most, because we see in them an integrity that we wish we could have had. We see in them a love that we wish we could have. We see in them a commitment that we wish that we could have. And so it is in times of adversity that we are actually remembered the most. In times of adversity that we display things that people would desire to embody and emulate in their lives the most. And so consider Jesus Christ, for example. Hebrews 12 tells us, who for the joy that was set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame. And so Christ's greatest model to us, his greatest witness to us has come what? Through the cross, through the suffering that he endured on the cross. And so we look at Christ and in the adversity he had to face, and we see in Christ something of beauty that we want to model our lives after. And so parents, whether you be parents of biological or spiritual children, set them an example through suffering and adversity in how you deal with those things, emulating the fruit of the Spirit in your life as you navigate through the difficulties of life, because those are the times that they will remember most. Those are the times where you will display most what it means to be someone who lives by faith, trusting in God and God alone. Then the third thing that we see that Moses' parents set for their children, lay as a foundation for their future faithfulness, is that they must have had conversations with their children, but not just random conversations about the weather or how bad the times were in Egypt and what they would have for breakfast in the morning. But no, they must have had specific conversations with their children that was centered around God's future grace. This hope in God's future grace that somehow through His grace, God will intervene. God will turn our mourning into dancing. Why? Because He is that gracious and that merciful. Now, where do we see that at play in the life of Moses and in the way that his parent parented them? So there came a time where they could no longer keep Moses hidden. Right? They kept him hidden for 3 months, but then it was becoming harder and harder for them to keep him hidden. And so here's what his mom in particular decided to do. She built a basket that was waterproof and placed him in it, and then left this basket at a riverbank in hope for what? That by God's grace and providence, something other than the death of Moses would occur. And so what was she hoping for? Hoping for something in God's future grace, that God would have mercy, that God would have grace, that God would look down on favor over Moses and see a different outcome play itself out in his life. Not only do we see that at play in Moses' mom, but then we also notice that at play in Moses' sister, the older sister, Miriam. Because what does she do when mom leaves a basket at a river bank? She actually steps back a bit and she watches at a distance, watching to see what would happen to Moses. And of course, as the story plays out, Pharaoh's own daughter comes to take a bath, and she's besotted by Moses and adopts him as her own child. And so, but yet Miriam was watching at a distance all this time. And so what's that saying? It is saying that Miriam was also hoping for something, for a different outcome, like her mom. Looking onwards and really hoping that perhaps God in His grace will bring about a redemption in the story as it is playing itself out. And so the question becomes, where did Miriam get this kind of hope? What her hope? And the only logical answer will be from her parents. That somehow perhaps in their household they were continuously conversing about the circumstances that they were finding themselves in. And as mom is building this basket, she's conversing with her children, continually saying that no, we got to hope in the Lord, we got to hope in the grace of God, that in the abundance of His future grace, that He can bring about a particular different outcome to this particular scenario that will see us rejoice in His goodness. And so there must have been conversations around the future grace of God. And so parents of children, biological one or spiritual one, are we engaging them in conversations over God's future grace, over what God could do in the future by His grace through their lives, of how God can use and redeem their lives for the sake of the gospel, and really utilize them in this life in a way that brings about the fulfillment of His plan and goodness over our lives. I will never forget one of the men in my life that played a significant role in mentoring me and discipling me. I will never forget the one conversation that radically set the trajectory for my life in ministry. And it was one night and one evening in his home, and we were sitting after supper, and he asked me this particular question, and he said, "Buddy, what does God want you to do about the world? What does God want you to do about the world?" And that question just set us on track to discuss that night what is possible in the future grace of God. What could God perhaps achieve and do through my life? Not that I'm anything special, but like that He is special and He is abundant in grace and can use our lives to achieve His purposes. What does God want to do through you? Through you, that would radically change the world. And so as we began to talk about that dreaming about that, it just began to cascade into small little steps of actions that has led to me laying down my life before Him and saying, Lord, use me for the sake of your kingdom. And so parents, if we want to see our children go on in a legacy of faithfulness, we've got to be conversing with them, not just about any random thing, but conversing with them in particular about what is possible through the future grace of God that is poured out upon their lives. So parents, as we long to see our children, whether they be biological or spiritual, go on to live a life of faith and go on to live a legacy of faith long after we are gone. Let us remember that it first begins with me. Am I committed in following God's purpose and God's purpose alone? Then next, setting them an example, especially through adversity, of what it will mean to be faithful in pursuing God. And then third, engage them in conversations over God's future grace. And then let us see God use them, perhaps even use them far more than He has been able to use us to really advance its kingdom and His great glory. Pursue laying down foundations for a legacy of faithfulness in the generation to come. See you in the next video.